listening to Unfiltered with Muhammad Uncut, a podcast about personal growth and authentic leadership. If you're looking for tips on how to manage others, get ahead, and make your way up the corporate ladder, this is not the show for you. This podcast is about being of service to others, leading from the heart, and evolving into a better version of yourself. Each episode brings you motivated stories about unfiltered leadership and authentic leaders, those who involve others, use their influence to amplify diverse perspectives, and inspire teams to achieve collective results. If this sounds like you, keep listening. Welcome to the Unfiltered Podcast, and welcome to my unfiltered guest, Jacqueline Kappers. Good afternoon, Jacqueline. How are you?
I'm really well, Mohammed. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad that you're able to join me this afternoon. And Jacqueline, you and I go back quite a bit of time because we've been together, learning together. We've been students together. We've been in the same learning environment. So it's always a pleasure to listen to your perspective and to learn from you and to hear what you're all about and why you believe leadership of ourselves first is important, because as the listeners know, this podcast, the Unfiltered Podcast, it's about us leading ourselves, becoming the best sort of leaders for ourselves, having that personal transformation so that we can become better leaders for others. And that's what we're going to hear about you and what gets you up in the morning, what leadership means to you. But before, I'm going to turn it over to you and just help my readers understand a bit more who Jacqueline Kappers is.
Well, thanks. I'm a change management consultant and professional coach. A few years ago, I got really interested in resistance, which is something that's very familiar to everyone who's a change practitioner and leader in an organization, and realized that we're actually missing a part of the process. So to prepare people for change. So over the last year and a half, I've really been digging into that particular part of the process, which looks at our humanity, who we are as human animals, really, and how that applies to the organizational context.
I love it. And this is so in tune with what this podcast is all about and what I look to learn when I meet with people like you, and what I hope I can pass on in terms of learning or opportunities to grow for the listener, because it is about change. It's about how we interact with change. You know, we can't hold change back, and we shouldn't have to. But to your point about resistance, we can be so resistant to embracing change and understanding that change can actually be such a positive step in our life. Because at the end of the day, whether or not we embrace change, guess what?
It's going to happen.
Happens. You got it.
Happen. It's the only thing we can rely on, change and death.
Well, tell me a bit about this resistance and what I may have something in mind when you say resistance, and the listeners certainly may have something in mind, but educate us on what do you mean by resistance?
Well, I'm going to work backwards a little bit. So all of us have experienced organizational changes, and some of us have experienced more than others, and to the point where they're rolling their eyes. In the process, there are always those people that are on board right away. There's no problem. And then there are the people that we scratch our heads at and go like, why aren't you on board? Because this is such a great thing. You know, it'll be so good for our company. And for some reason, they're like, yeah, I don't really feel this. So I started looking at that, why that happens. And I realized that in looking through neuropsychology and evolutionary psychology, organizational behavior and developmental psychology, plus a whole lot of common sense, I realized that we're overlooking the humanity in that process, how humans actually respond to change, where they perceive a loss of attachment. So change is not comfortable. I don't know a whole lot of people that say, yeah, I do change. I eat change for breakfast. Most of us really, really don't appreciate change. And especially in what we're going through now, like COVID changed everything for everybody all across the world. And we're seeing things like people are feeling overwhelmed and uncertain and fearful. And you know what? All that is normal, because our brains, when they perceive a change, they see it as a threat. And because part of our brain called an amygdala, which triggers our fight, flight, or freeze response, acts faster than our ability to really think things through, we go into this state of survival. And that causes all sorts of stress hormones and stress responses. And that's really uncomfortable. It's actually physically uncomfortable and it's emotionally uncomfortable because it creates anxiety. It creates fear and apathy and sadness. And it's really uncomfortable. We don't like change. But what we do is we shame those emotions in our society. We suppress them. We judge them. We we medicate them. And rather than do, and that doesn't allow us as human animals to process change, because this response is actually, the adaptive response is a physiological response that we've been given in order to adapt to change. But what we're doing in this society of toxic positivity is saying, essentially, keep drinking, drink as much water as you can, deal with as much change as possible, but you're never allowed to pee.
Mm.
And that's what
Ouch,
we're
I
falling down.
felt that. I felt that. Let me drink to that.
So what we're doing, we're falling down. We're actually preventing people from going through the adaptive process. And that causes people to get sick and sad and isolated and addicted in order to numb out that pain. And in my case, divorced. Wow. So, you know, the results of not allowing yourself, your brain, to process change where you perceive loss, no good can come of that. Wow. So that's where I'm applying this to the organization, and we can apply this to our own personal leadership, how we show up in our own lives, in our own systems, in our own families and communities.
Much needed discussion and perspective, and there's so much to unpack there. I'm not sure I can start, but some of the I seriously, some of the takeaways is I so authentically appreciate how you gave us the physiological background. This is, the how the neuroscientists might talk to us and what happens to us and why it's fight or flight and why it's second nature for us to react. But what I love about what you said particularly, and thank you for also being vulnerable enough to personalize this and let us know that you're in the midst of it, or we're always in the midst of it. But
all
thank you for your openness and sharing that it's impacted you. Because I think lived experiences can speak volumes to experiences that we just study and share. So thank you for that. But when you said that this is also not just the neuroscience, you said it's common sense. And I think for people who don't have that background, who may not understand the academic or the physiological explanation, will definitely say, yeah, this is common sense. You know what? When I'm forced to react to something, when I see change. And, when you're saying change, by the way, Jacqueline, I'm like, yeah, I do have change for breakfast, but then you pushed me to thinking, well, I probably have change for breakfast because I've learned to adapt, but to some of the things that aren't on my plate and that cause me to sit back and think, oh, this feels uncomfortable. We all have different levels of resistance.
Exactly.
Right?
And that's a really important point, because we all experience change differently, because what we interpret as loss is different for each of us, and how we respond to that loss is different. You and I can go through the same change and you'll have no problem with it, but because I was attached to that, whatever it was beforehand, I'm going to have that change reaction. I'm going to have that reaction of anxiety, and I'm going to need the skills and the knowledge to get my body through that.
Right.
So sounds like you're pretty change resilient. And that's what I aim to teach people, is change resilience and change preparedness, so that as leaders, we're able to be more resilient ourselves, but also to increase the level of trust that our followers have in us, create those safe spaces so that our followers are able to adapt. And
I say, and I know, our discussion, we tend to focus on workplaces and communities, but even in our personal relationships, right?
Very much so.
How important it is to have these relationships. And, you shared in that maybe if you had been a little more resilient, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you said that you ended up being in a state where you're divorced now, and right. And so sometimes if we can reflect on where we've been and where we want to go and where we are, that self-awareness is going to help us understand how we can adapt, right?
Yes, I think that, well, I was personally handed a lot of plates of grief and loss over the last number of years. And my mentor, Dr. Roger Dean Duncan, who wrote a number of the books behind me, actually, told me, well, he told me to go straight through the grief. So experience it in its fullest, like whatever my body needed to do that. Sleep if I needed to sleep, cry if I needed to cry, talk if I needed to talk, and just go straight through the grief. What we do in our society is to suppress it, and it ends up in this, because we're ashamed to
Get
be
up.
fearful.
Don't
Yeah,
cry.
just keep going,
Yeah.
okay, it changed, let's move on.
You'll be
And
okay.
yeah, just plaster on a smile. And social media is actually a lot to blame for this.
Or go pray, right?
Yeah, you could go pray. But what ends up happening is that there's a disconnect between our internal emotional state and what we're showing to the world. So because we're pressured to conform to this toxic positivity that our culture expects of us, to never show the bad stuff, never hang your dirty laundry out on social media, right? Always show the smile.
Or just pretend it's not dirty, filter it. And this is why I say this is unfiltered, because we filter our social media so it looks perfect, well, like right before we came on here, we're both like checking ourselves out and making sure, right? We feel like crap sometimes. It's okay to feel like crap, but we're told no, right? And
exactly.
Right.
And in the organization, the culture of professionalism in the organization actually requires us to go through change, live in uncertain environments, go through changes, many changes, go through them quickly, but we never allow ourselves to, we never allow the human in us to adapt. So it ends up in increased absenteeism and disengagement and disillusionment. Next, like further changes, you see more resistance, you see turnover. So it's a simple fix if we are courageous enough to accept what needs to be done in ourselves and others.
Well, you also talk about medicating, and it's so true. And I'll tell you why I said what I said earlier about prayer. I'm a very faithful person, very spiritual, but I don't like to take pills, and I don't think that our relationship with a higher force, God, whatever you believe in, is always it's part of the answer. But if somebody's physiologically, mentally, physically sick, I don't tell somebody, go pray, because God wants us to get better, and prayer can help and meditation can help, but sometimes we need different sort of help. We need professionals, right? We may need medication, but that's not the first place to go, right? You go to the doctor and they throw, meds at you, which I hate. But, sometimes we need friendship. We need people to listen. But even we need to do what you're saying is we tell people to show up with so many different personas, and if, put on all these different masks, they don't know who they are at the end of the day. Exactly. And you don't know who you're working with. And I think, that leads me to the question about, you talk about positive toxicity. I'm dying to know how you describe that. And because it seems like a lot of us are living life within this positive toxicity. Can you elaborate on what that is?
Sure. And I want to come back to something you said as well, because can I address that first?
Yeah, of course.
God made us the way, I have a very strong faith as well. And God made us, he created us this way. He gave us all the tools that we need to survive in the environment that we have. When we go through change, we experience loss, or we may experience loss. And it's the loss that causes the loss of predictability, the loss of attachment, that causes that anxiety in us. Now, the process to get through that is called grieving, but the majority of us don't understand grief outside of the context of bereavement. But grieving is an adaptive process to go from loss of attachment to a new state. And historically, we have, when grief is not processed, it becomes solidified grief. And historically, that has been medicated. It's looked like depression and anxiety, and it's been medicated or pathologized in some way, when really what the person needs is to name the loss, validate the loss, and have in companionship and have someone help that person, support that person in creating meaning around that loss. They don't need medication in that case. I'm not saying that there aren't cases that are absolutely requiring, medication and other medical interventions, clinical interventions. I'm saying in the case of change where loss is perceived, that the process to get through that is companionship, meditation, prayer, and a whole number of other measures. So please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that.
That's exactly where I want to go with this. Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to be very clear on that. Toxic positivity, yeah, that's a really interesting concept. I don't know when it happened, probably around somewhere where social media was introduced, where we had to show our best face. And culturally speaking, we live in a stiff upper lip kind of culture. You don't discuss the bad parts. You always keep a stiff upper lip. You keep on going. And you suppress anything that's bad. If you're sad, you suppress it. If you're angry, you suppress it. If you're frustrated, you don't talk about it. But there's a lot of research that shows that if you don't process the emotions, which are essentially physical, that they're physical manifestations, or emotions are the manifestations of hormones that are shot into your body, stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. If you don't process them, eventually they'll make you sick. They lead to, things like heart disease, cancer, high blood pressure, and a whole range of other physical ailments. So toxic positivity for me is a disconnect between your internal emotional state and what you're portraying to the outside world because of, a sense of self-shame. If you can't talk about it because you'll be judged, or invalidation, it's not worth me talking about it because, it's not that big a deal. And that's where the concept of loss comes in again. We can name our tangible losses, but not our intangible losses, like the loss of status or the loss of how we thought our lives were going to be. COVID changed how we thought our lives were going to be, and that's what we're dealing with. But there's this enormous pressure in our culture to be positive, to just get on with it, to be strong, and that causes illness. It causes sadness. It causes isolation. And that's something that I really want to change with my message and our work.
Do you think that sort of loss and how we adapt is impacted by our gender? So where I'm going with this is I'd love to unpack how this impacts men.
Oh my goodness. I am so glad you said that.
Right. And I want you to address how you believe it impacts women, also because of the way we behave and I think discredit the female gender, females, and therefore we're propagating this sort of ailment and sickness because we're putting a lot of women in that position. I don't know if I'm wrong. I'll let you.
No. This is actually a conversation for a bottle of wine in like hours.
All right.
But we only have a little bit of time.
And I've got my water.
One of my colleagues in the Netherlands, Jacob van Wielink, or he's one of my mentors actually, Jacob van Wielink. He and I had a discussion a few weeks ago, and I asked him, I said, Jacob, I'm looking at this and with everything I know, could it be possible that men's lifespans are shorter than women's because they don't process their emotions effectively? They don't process loss effectively. And you know what he said to me? Absolutely. Yeah. That is absolutely the case. Now, it may not be the only reason why men's lifespans are shorter, but it's certainly one of the contributing factors. We teach our boys not to cry. Yeah. We expect our men to be strong and tough and always the provider. Yeah. And we shame vulnerability. We shame any show of emotion. Now, I think because, and I don't quote me on this, but I think because of our chemical makeup, it's harder for men to cry because of testosterone levels. I was reading something about that, but again, don't quote me on that.
Well, then I must have low testosterone.
But I think that we've condemned our men, an entire gender in our society,
Wow.
to depression and to isolation. And, the suicides among older men who are alone are astronomical. And if we made it okay to say, I am not okay, what would the impact be in terms of the things in our society that are generally considered to be male, like the level of crime, or the level of domestic abuse, or the level of alcoholism, or any number of things that we see. Yeah, a lot of men are in there. I'm not saying that women aren't, but I'd really like to change how we do that. My boys, I have two boys, they're 15 and 13. They've dealt with an enormous amount of loss as well. And I taught them when my marriage broke down and their father left, I taught them how to grieve, and they cried, and it was okay. And they talked to their friends, and it was okay. And I would very, very much like to see that attitude that it's okay for men to be human, because right now we've taken their humanity away. I would love it if we taught our men that it's okay to be human.
It's yeah, and think it's rewriting what the definition of manhood is. I grew up, I was
Yeah.
bullied, and I'm going to be sharing this more with people. And I tried to commit suicide when I was young because I was bullied, and very few people know about that. And I just did a video
Thanks for
today that
sharing.
I'm submitting to a few friends because they're gonna put this on their website, and I'm like, I can't say the S word. I'm 52 and I've moved on, but obviously not enough, because I still can't say it. I don't feel comfortable talking about it with my spouse, and because there's the shame involved. And so, to your point, we've taught, and I'll speak as a man to men, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to have this podcast, is to take away that negativity, take away that superficiality, that we can't be men and still be in touch with our predominantly feminine part, right? Because we're made up of masculine and feminine makeup, right? And it's okay to move towards what might be considered more female, right? And I grew up impacted by women in my life, continue to be. I always been in touch with that. But men here in a Western society, and I see a capitalistic society, are taught to be pillars that don't shake, that don't rattle, that don't quake, that don't break, that don't fall, that don't feel. And it's a sign of weakness. Whereas we're learning now, thanks to the likes of Brene Brown and others, that showing the vulnerability is courageous and it's okay to speak up, right?
Well, I'm going to respectfully challenge you, Mohammed,
Oh,
actually,
I'm open. I'm open.
because you bought into the masculine and feminine.
Okay.
As humans, as human animals, we were given an entire spectrum of emotions, and each one of them was designed to keep us safe, to keep us alive, and keep us part of the social group. So the emotions that we term negative each have an evolutionary purpose. There is no masculine or feminine in emotion. There is simply human.
Right.
And then there are the societal attitudes and judgments that we've created around this, that women are allowed to cry because they're weaker, right? We expect them to cry. I don't know how many men have just described past girlfriends and wives as crazy because they were very free in expressing how they felt. They expressed their anger, their frustration, their sadness. But from a male perspective, that's very uncomfortable, because if they create space for someone else to express those emotions, they have to come face to face with the fact that they're not doing it for themselves, and they don't know how to do that. It's interesting. I heard a statistic once. A hard crying jag, if somebody's crying really hard, really only takes 90 seconds to 2 minutes. and then it will subside, and then there might be another one.
Right.
But that really hard crying, that bawling, really only takes about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. But we as a society don't know how to manage strong emotions, those negative emotions. So I'm going to leave you with that challenge.
Wow.
To no longer label emotions or behaviors as masculine or feminine, but as human.
Human. And so to that, and I love this, and that's why I'm here, is I want to learn. So, that's why I have the experts come on, because I don't want to pretend to be the expert. But what I love about this, because I've been conditioned to believe what these different emotions are. We've been told, as a man, you feel this, and if you feel otherwise, then you're feeling, if you're feeling the unmanly, right, emotion, therefore you're feeling the female emotion, and this is what you're supposed to do or not to do, and vice versa to the woman, right? And right.
So
and
if you
your point, it's not
continue that,
it's about unmasking the BS that we've been fed all along about what we're supposed to be or not supposed to be, and recognize this is our humanity.
yes.
And it's also okay to feel this way. I think that's the other point, is it's
Oh,
okay to feel this way.
absolutely.
Okay.
It is absolutely okay to feel anger and to feel sadness and to cry. One should cry. Tears are a vehicle to get rid of stress hormones in your body, actually.
So let me bring it back to where you were going, and we got excited about just focusing on men. But let's go to, because now, I want to unpack how we've been putting women into these places, conditioning them to this paradigm of what womanhood is all about, or the female gender. And it's normally nothing we celebrate. To what you said earlier, well, my ex-girlfriend, she was just such a, right? She was like, right, crazy. Right? And so take me there and help me understand how things can be different. What do we need to do differently?
Well, I'm speaking from common sense. I'm not a psychologist, although I do have a background in organizational development and adult learning. So I have that, but I'm not a psychologist. I'm also a professional coach. So I just want to put that out there. I'm not a clinician. So I'm speaking from common sense. I think what we need to do is to accept that we are human animals. We've been given functions and processes to adapt to change, and we need to learn the skills and the knowledge and the attitudes to be able to recognize these emotions in ourselves, manage these emotions in ourselves. And by the way, manage does not mean suppress. Emotional intelligence does not mean suppress. It means manage. And do it for ourselves and for others. We need to stop shaming those that are responding differently than us, than we would expect. There was at the beginning of COVID isolation, there was this infographic that went around LinkedIn. It was 3 circles. They were blue. The darkest one had, fear and anger and I'm constantly complaining. And then there was a lighter blue one that went, yeah, I'm starting to get used to it. I'm afraid. And then the lightest blue one was like, yeah, I'm all over the adaptations. I'm learning a new language. And a very dear friend of mine posted it. And she said, well, where are you? Like, we should get to the light blue one, light blue circle. That's where we all need to be. And that was that we all need to shift and be happy about the change. Mm-hmm. And I came back and respectfully said, everybody changes differently at different rates for different reasons, using different tools and methods. And if you're still in the dark blue, and you're feeling anxious and afraid, are we then not grief shaming? So it's a double whammy. They're having to deal with the changes that COVID has brought, and then the shame of being thought of as not good enough or not strong enough to be learning a new language right away or baking the day away. And she came back and she said, you know what, you're right. We need to stop grief shaming. We need to stop assuming that everything's going to be okay. I'm not advocating for temper tantrums in the office. What I'm advocating for is an understanding that negative emotions, as we term them, are normal. They're a normal response. They're human. To manage them in ourselves, to stop being ashamed, to stop judging others for them, and simply make space. There's a very simple process for dealing with change and loss. And it's as simple as naming the loss, naming the intangible losses as well, creating meaning around them, or naming them, validating them in companionship, because we're social animals. So we need to sit with someone else and have that person say, you know what, that really sucked. I get it. I understand.
That's
so have that empathy.
Right.
And then create meaning around it. Because really, when you look at it, anxiety is not something to be suppressed. It's actually a trigger, a signal for us to get creative. Mm. The way we knew things were going to be is lost. So we need to get creative. So we need to reposition anxiety as well as not something to be suppressed, but as this trigger that allows us to be extremely innovative and creative and find a new way forward.
And Jacqueline, is it fair to say, because what I'm hearing is you're shifting the mindset and how we react or respond. But what I'm also hearing is that space between the space between feeling the hurt and the pain and needing to feel it, validating it, naming it, validating it, and then replacing it with something more creative, innovative, healthier, let's say, that space is different for all of us.
That's
and
different.
We need to understand that for others, because the shaming comes when I start looking and say, can you get on? Can you move along already? It's been a few days, it's been a few years, right? Like, I've had a sister, she's been grieving for her lost son he died in 1999, 21 years. My dad died 20 years ago, and my friend just lost his father 2 days ago. And I relived what I went through with my father when my best friend lost his father a couple of days ago. And so while the acuteness of what he's feeling compared to what I could have felt only momentarily in empathizing with him a few days ago, I've moved on. Time does heal some wounds, but differently for others. And for some, maybe not to the extent that we'd like. And I'm coming back to that space, right?
Well, there are different types of loss, and what you're talking about is non-finite loss. It's the loss that keeps on giving.
Yeah.
So you learn to integrate, and you're talking about bereavement as well. So you learn to create a new relationship with the person that has passed. But for a non-death loss, say the loss of a job or the loss of a promotion you were really counting on, you learn to integrate that loss into your life so you can continue to function normally. But every once in a while, you're going to see something that triggers that feeling of loss again. Every time I see the back of a certain type of man, the loss of my husband is triggered, for example. Or every time I drive past a certain building in Ottawa where I used to work, I'm right back there again. And
that's okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely okay.
And I'm asking, but I'm also reminding others that we have to let ourselves know it's okay.
It's normal. It's
human. But we're so told, getting back to your positive toxicity, we're told to just embrace that. No, life can be better. Well, it can be. But to get there, I guess then my question to you, what I'm hearing from you is, grief is okay.
Grief is okay. And coming back to the neurological aspect of this, when we're in amygdala hijack and our brain is going, what the heck? I don't understand what just happened, but my path of predictability is gone. We're not able to think creatively. We're not able to think positively or the benefits of whatever. So the process of coaching through loss gets our brain to move from amygdala hijack back to the frontal lobe, where we can think creatively and more positively about the benefits. You will get there faster than me, maybe, for some things. I will get there faster than you.
For other things.
But for other things. And it's that when we see resistance, because that's where we started, when we see resistance to change or someone who keeps sitting in the loss, they haven't had the opportunity to have that loss named or validated. So that's what we need to be really careful about. Don't push people, because the tendency in organizations when we're dealing with organizational change is to communicate a lot about the benefits and have people talk about the benefits and what this means to them and how good the change is going to be. But if you've got people that are sitting in amygdala hijack, they're not going to be able to talk about it. And that's where you see resistance. The resistance is not to the change itself, but to the discomfort of the loss of attachment to the previous state. So be careful, be empathetic. Everybody's going to be different than you. Their reactions are normal, they're human. And it's our responsibility as individuals and leaders to learn who we are ourselves in the loss process, get to know our own grief fingerprint or transition fingerprint, as it were, and then be empathetic and create space for the transitioning of others. And when I say transition fingerprint, I mean that very literally, really, or figuratively. As many people as there are in the world, we each have different fingerprints. And that's how many types or ways there are of going through change. We each deal with this uniquely and individually and in our own time.
Beautiful. And you definitely put a different layer on now for HR professionals and leaders, people leaders in an organization. And I'm going to be transparent with you that it's an added responsibility, because now we're asking them to be so much more aware, right? It's not easy to lead people. So first, it's that awareness of ourselves and knowing how can we lead ourselves better and be more aware of our need to grieve and to adapt to change and become more resilient and less resistant. But now we're asking people who work and lead others to also recognize that in people and others. And I guess this is where it leads me into what I call the unfiltered thought of the week. This is where I ask the guest to, whether it's advice or best practices or any sort of aha that you have, what would you say to those people in an organization or in a relationship? What would you say to someone to help them support others who are going through this naming process of the grief or the feeling or the emotion associated with it? How can they do it?
What would I say to them? I think it would be this, that historically, we've been missing a part in the change process. We've been missing the humanity. And get to know your own transition fingerprint first, and then understand that everyone has one, so that when you're going through change processes, you can create a situation where the change is adopted more quickly. You'll have less resistance. You'll have more trust and more engagement in your team. So airplane rules, figure it out for yourself first, put that oxygen mask on for yourself first, have the courage to face it yourself first, and then make sure you're doing it for others.
Wow. Thank you, Jacqueline. Truly, I've learned quite a bit in the past 40 minutes that you and I have been chatting. And, I'm going to have to re-listen to this a few times, because you've helped us unpack a lot of great tips for managing, right? And, managing, not suppressing, and how we can do it better for ourselves and how we can do it better for others. So thank you for being my unfiltered guest and talking about the value of being unfiltered. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being my guest. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Unfiltered, the show about authentic leadership and personal growth. Like what you heard? Click subscribe, share it, and tell a friend about it. And don't forget to leave a rating.